Christmas morning, 7 months pregnant, and her husband's hands on her back. Not to hold her, not to comfort her, to push. 5 stories down. No railing to grab, no one to catch her. Just December air and the Christmas lights blurring red and green as she fell toward the pavement below. She should have died.
You look beautiful,
She didn't.
Claire.
Because of a
Everything is
car,
gonna be fine.
not just any car. The car belonging to the billionaire she had walked away from 5 years earlier. The man she had left for the husband who just tried to murder her. Now here's the part that will stay with you long after this story ends. Surviving the fall was not the hardest part. What came after? The lies, the courtroom, the woman she had to become to fight back. That is what this story is really about. Stay with me. You need to hear all of it. Lesson statement. This story is for every woman who has ever made herself smaller to keep the peace. It is proof that the truth, no matter how long it takes to speak, is always worth saying out loud. If Claire's story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar or gave you something you needed today, I want to ask you one small thing. Leave a comment below. It does not have to be long. It can be one word. It can be, I needed this, or I know someone like Claire, or just, thank you. Because every comment tells me that this story reached someone. And every story I tell because someone out there needs to hear it. If you believe someone else needs Claire's story right now, a friend, a sister, someone quietly going through something they have not named yet, share this video. Your share costs you 10 seconds. It might mean everything to someone else. And if you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button. Every week, we bring you stories like this one. Real in spirit, raw in truth. Stories about survival, about justice, about people who refused to let their worst moment be their last chapter. Like this video if it moved you. Subscribe if you want more. Share it if you know someone who needs it. And until next time, remember this. The door is never as locked as it seems. You are stronger than you know. Take care of yourselves.
The Christmas lights blurred into streaks of red and green as I fell. 5 stories, 7 months pregnant. My husband's hands still warm on my back from the push. Time does something strange when you fall. It stretches. Each second becomes its own small lifetime. I had enough time to think 3 complete thoughts on the way down. The first thought was my baby. I pressed both hands to my stomach, even as the air rushed past me, cold and sharp, and smelling like someone's fireplace 3 floors up. My fingers spread wide across the curve of my belly. 7 months of growing, of hoping, of quietly naming her in the dark when Nathan was asleep, and I could finally breathe hope. I had decided that morning, Christmas morning, while stirring orange juice and hiding a bruise under a turtleneck. Her name would be Hope. The second thought was embarrassingly practical. I thought about the laundry I had left in the dryer. The third thought arrived half a second before impact, and it was the strangest of all. It was not fear, it was recognition, because I looked down and I saw the car I was about to land on, and even from 5 stories up, even falling, even dying, I knew that car. I had ridden in that car 100 times. I had fallen asleep in the passenger seat with my shoes off and the heater running and a man beside me who looked over at red lights just to make sure I was still there. James Whitmore's car. Of all the streets in Brooklyn, of all the cars parked along the curb on Christmas morning. 5 years after I walked away from the best man I had ever known, I was about to land on his Mercedes at terminal velocity. The impact came like the world ending, then darkness, then a machine beeping, steady and patient, telling me I was still alive. Surviving the fall was the easy part. What came next almost finished the job Nathan started. This is the story of the year that broke me, rebuilt me, and taught me the difference between a woman who survives and a woman who finally, completely lives. Let me take you back to before the fall, to the version of me who stood in that kitchen on Christmas morning and told herself everything was fine. Her name was Claire Harrington Cole. She was 32 years old, formerly a marketing executive at a mid-size firm in Manhattan, currently unemployed by slow degrees, currently 7 months pregnant, currently hiding a bruise on her left wrist with a turtleneck sweater in December, which was at least seasonally appropriate. She made perfect pancakes, light golden, the kind that required real buttermilk and a hot pan and patience. She squeezed fresh orange juice. She arranged bacon in neat rows. She set the table with the good dishes, the ones Nathan's mother, Margaret, had given them as a wedding gift. Heavy white porcelain with a thin gold rim, the kind of dishes that said, "We are a certain kind of family." She was very good at setting tables. Rachel had texted at 7:45 that morning. Before Margaret arrived, in that small window of time when Claire was still herself. Rachel Green, ER nurse, best friend since sophomore year of college, the person who said everything Claire was only allowed to think. The text read, "Merry Christmas to you and your fetus. How's life with the Wicked Witch of New Jersey today?" Claire had typed back one-handed while flipping a pancake. "She's not here yet. Arrives at 9. I've already stress-baked 24 cookies." Rachel, "That's a trauma response." Claire, "They're snickerdoodles." Rachel, "Still a trauma response. Beautiful, delicious trauma." Claire had smiled at her phone. It was the last uncomplicated smile of the morning. Margaret Cole arrived at 9:03, which was 3 minutes later than scheduled, which she mentioned. She came through the door in a cloud of lavender perfume, an expensive coat, arms full of gifts wrapped in coordinating paper, silver and white, because Margaret coordinated her Christmas wrapping. She was 61 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had decided at 40 that the world owed her deference and had been collecting on that debt ever since. She kissed Claire's cheek without quite touching it. She squeezed both of Claire's hands and looked at her stomach with an expression that managed to be simultaneously warm and assessing. "You look tired, dear," Margaret said. "Thank you," Claire said. Nathan came out of the bedroom then, and the whole room rearranged itself around him the way rooms did when Nathan walked in. He was handsome in a way that had seemed like a gift when Claire met him 4 years ago and felt like a threat now. Broad shoulders, easy smile. The particular confidence of a man who had never once in his life doubted that he deserved to be wherever he was. He kissed his mother. He put his arm around Claire. He said all the right things about the food, the table, how beautiful everything looked. Claire watched his hands while he talked. She always watched his hands now. Breakfast was pleasant, the way performances are pleasant. Margaret talked about her friends, her holiday parties, a cruise she was considering for February. Nathan talked about a real estate deal that was going very well, which Claire knew was not true because she had found the credit card statements 2 weeks ago, 3 cards in her name she had not known existed, maxed to a combined total of $60,000. She had not said anything. She had learned over 4 years which conversations were survivable and which were not. After breakfast, Nathan opened the balcony door for fresh air while Margaret put on her coat. The December cold came in like something with teeth. Claire started clearing the plates. Margaret hugged her goodbye at the door, the same not quite touching hug, and leaned in close. "You're doing wonderfully," Margaret murmured. "Just keep him happy, Claire. That's all any of us can do." Then she left. The door closed. The elevator hummed. Nathan was silent for 11 seconds. Claire counted them, while stacking plates because she had learned to count silences. On the 12th second, he said, $60,000 doesn't appear from nowhere. Claire set down the plates very carefully. Nathan, she said. Not his name as an address. His name as a warning she was giving herself. I needed capital, he said. His voice had shifted into the register. That meant the performance was over. The register that meant she should calculate her distance to the nearest door. You don't understand business. You've never understood business. I understand that my credit was used without my knowledge, Claire said. She was proud of how steady her voice came out. It had taken years to learn that. You can speak calmly about the thing that is about to hurt you. You're unbelievable, Nathan said, moving toward her. You really are. I'm building something. I'm trying to build something for this family, and you stand there with that face like I'm the problem. She backed toward the living room. He followed. This was the choreography of their marriage. These slow retreats, these advances. This baby is why I'm trapped, he said. His voice dropped lower, which was worse than when he shouted. You know that, right? You did this on purpose. We talked about having children, Claire said. We talked about someday. Not a trap. Not now. Not when I have collection agencies calling my office. She had reached the edge of the living room. Behind her was the balcony door, still open, still letting in a December. She turned to close it. That was the mistake. Nathan moved faster than she expected. He always moved faster than she expected. His hands closed on her shoulders before she could orient herself, before she could recalculate, and he walked her backward, and she grabbed the door frame with both hands and held on. She held on very hard. He pried her fingers loose, one by one. She had time for 3 thoughts on the way down, then darkness, then a machine, then a nurse with kind eyes leaning over her, saying, "Your baby is alive. Both of you are fighters." Claire pressed her fingers to her stomach in the hospital bed and felt the small flutter of movement there, insistent and determined, and she started crying in a way she had not cried in 4 years. Not quiet tears, not careful tears. The kind that come from somewhere below language. "Your baby is alive," the nurse said again. Claire could not speak. She just nodded, pressing her hand to her stomach, feeling hope move against her palm like a small fist knocking on a door. "I know," Claire managed finally. "I know she is." When Detective Diane Foster arrived 40 minutes later, she walked into Claire's hospital room, looked at the bruise on Claire's wrist that the turtleneck no longer covered, looked at the fractured pelvis documented on Claire's chart, looked at Claire herself, and said to the nurse standing nearby, "The husband do this." It was not a question. The nurse hesitated. Foster said, "I'll take that as a yes." She pulled a chair to Claire's bedside and sat down, and she did not have a notebook out yet, and she did not have her recorder running yet. She just sat, and she looked at Claire like she was a person who deserved to be looked at like a person. "Mrs. Cole," Foster said, "I'm going to ask you some questions, but first, I want to tell you something. I have worked homicide and domestic cases in this city for 18 years. And the most important thing I have learned in 18 years is this. The first time a woman tells her truth out loud is the hardest. After that, it gets easier." Claire looked at the detective's gray eyes. Clear, steady, no judgment there. She had planned, in the event she ever ended up somewhere like this, to say she had slipped. She had rehearsed it. She had practiced the words and the accompanying expression, the slightly embarrassed smile, so clumsy. Pregnancy makes me so clumsy. The lie was right there on the tip of her tongue, familiar as a prayer. She let it go. "My husband pushed me off our balcony," Claire said. The words sat in the air between them, solid and real, the first completely honest sentence she had spoken about Nathan Cole in 4 years. Detective Foster nodded. She opened her notebook. "Tell me everything," Foster said. "From the beginning," Claire told her. She was midway through when the door burst open and Margaret swept in, lavender perfume, an expensive coat, and looked at Claire with eyes that had gone calculating behind the performance of distress. My son would never, Margaret began. Foster stood up. She was not a large woman, but she took up the room in a way that had nothing to do with size. You need to wait outside, Foster said. This is my daughter-in-law, Margaret said. This is my grandchild. I have every right. Security will remove you if you prefer that option, Foster said pleasantly. Margaret looked at Claire. Something passed across her face, quick and cold. She leaned down. She kissed Claire's forehead with those lips that never quite made contact. Be very careful, dear, Margaret whispered, about what you say, about what you think you remember. Then she straightened her coat, nodded at Detective Foster with the graciousness of a woman who was choosing to be gracious, and left. The room was colder after she walked out. Claire looked at Detective Foster. She's going to say I jumped, Claire said. Foster looked back at her. I know. People will believe her. Some will, Foster agreed. She sat back down. She picked up her pen. She met Claire's eyes. Let's make sure the evidence says otherwise. Outside Claire's hospital window, Christmas morning continued without them. Someone in the building across the street had their tree visible through the glass, lights blinking patient and slow. A family somewhere was opening presents. A child somewhere was shrieking with delight over something that came in a box. Inside the room, Claire Harrington Cole kept talking. For the first time in 4 years, she did not stop. There is something almost cosmically rude about landing on your ex-boyfriend's car. That was Rachel's assessment, delivered from the chair beside Claire's hospital bed on Christmas afternoon, after 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee and the full accounting of events. Like the universe couldn't just let you survive, Rachel said. It had to editorialize. Claire had laughed for the first time in what felt like years. It hurt her ribs. It was worth it. Rachel Green was 32 years old, an ER nurse at New York Presbyterian, and the kind of friend who showed up. Not figuratively, literally. She had been paged to her own emergency department that morning for a 12-hour shift, and had still managed to appear at Claire's bedside by 2 in the afternoon, still in her scrubs. Hair escaped from its ponytail in approximately 7 different directions. She had walked in, seen Claire in the hospital bed, seen the monitors, seen the evidence of everything, and had not said, "Oh my God," or "I knew it," or "I told you so," though she had told Claire so, gently and repeatedly, for the better part of 2 years. She had sat down, she had taken Claire's hand, then she had said, very quietly, "We are going to burn his entire life to the ground, legally." I want to be clear that I mean legally. Claire had said, "I know." Rachel had said, "Good, now tell me everything." So Claire had told her, and Rachel had listened, and her face had cycled through shock and fury and grief the way weather moves across an open field, fast and readable, and not trying to be anything other than what it was. When Claire finished, Rachel sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "The car, James Whitmore's car." "Yes," Claire said. "James Whitmore, who you left 5 years ago." "Yes." James Whitmore, who is, by any objective measure, the most decent human being either of us has ever personally encountered. Claire looked at the ceiling. Yes. Rachel absorbed this. She is going to need a minute. The look on her face said. She took the minute. Then she said, "The universe is not subtle." "No," Claire agreed. "The thing about James Whitmore was that he was not supposed to still matter." Claire had made her decision 5 years ago on a New Year's Eve very much like this one, in a penthouse very much like his, and she had been so certain, so completely, utterly, wrongly certain. She had met him at a charity gala when she was 27. She had been there representing her firm. He had been there as a donor, which was not unusual for James, who funded things the way other people breathed continuously and without particular fanfare. They had talked for 2 hours about books and the ethics of technology and whether hot dogs counted as sandwiches, and at the end, he had asked for her number with the directness of a man who did not play games. She had given it to him. 2 years followed that were, by any objective standard, wonderful. James was brilliant and patient and quietly, devastatingly kind. He was also wealthy in the way that old mountains are tall, so completely and fundamentally that it stopped being a feature and became simply the landscape. He had a penthouse. He had a car that Claire had loved riding in. He had a world full of people who were exceptional at things, and he moved through that world with easy grace. And Claire had felt every single day like a tourist. Nathan had seen it. Nathan, charming and attentive and relentless in his pursuit of her at exactly the moment she was most vulnerable, had named the thing she felt before she had words for it. "He's collecting you," Nathan had said early on, when she was still keeping him at arm's length out of loyalty to James. "You know that. The gifts, the trips, your art to him." It was a lie. She knew that now with the absolute certainty of someone who had lived the comparison in full. Nathan was the one who collected. Nathan was the one who treated people like objects with utility. James had simply loved her, plainly and well, and she had been too frightened of her own unworthiness to let him. She had ended things with James on New Year's Day, 5 years ago, over the phone, because she could not bear to see his face when she said it. He had asked why. She had given him every platitude she owned. He had listened to all of them with the patience that was the most characteristic thing about him. And then he had said, "If you change your mind, I'm not going anywhere." She had not changed her mind for 5 years. She had married Nathan Cole by summer. She had been so certain that normal and manageable and equal meant safe. She had learned slowly and then all at once that it meant something else entirely. The security guard appeared in Claire's hospital room doorway at 4 in the afternoon. "There's a man here to see you," the guard said. "A Mr. James Whitmore. He has an attorney with him. They're asking about your case." Claire looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at Claire. "Send them in," Claire said. James Whitmore walked through her hospital room door in jeans and a gray sweater. No tie, no entourage, looking exactly as he had looked the last time she saw him, except for 5 years of accumulated time around his eyes. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved across his face. "Hello, Claire," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered, warm and level, with the particular quality of a person who says what they mean. "I'm sorry about your car," Claire said. "The car is fine," James said. "Are you?" She looked at him. She had not cried since the initial flood of tears upon waking, had held herself together through Foster's questions and Margaret's visit and Rachel's arrival and all of it. "I'm alive," Claire said. James nodded. Like that was enough. Like that was actually enough. Not performatively, but genuinely. "This is Scott Brennan," James said, stepping aside. "He's a criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor. He'd like to represent you pro bono, if you're willing." Scott Brennan was somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a suit that said, "I am here to work," carrying a briefcase that said, "I have already begun." He had the eyes of a man who had heard every variation of every story and was still paying attention. "Mrs. Cole," Scott said, "I've reviewed the preliminary police report. With your permission, I'd like to start immediately." "I don't understand," Claire said. She looked at James. "Why?" James's jaw tightened slightly. "Because Nathan Cole is never going to hurt you again," he said. "I'm going to help make sure of that." Rachel, from her chair, said quietly, "I like him." "You've met him once?" Claire said. "I've met him twice," Rachel said. "The gala 5 years ago. You introduced us. I've liked him since then." Claire looked at James. She thought about saying no. Pride had its reasons. Independence had its reasons. The long habit of not taking anything from anyone, not wanting to owe anyone, not wanting to be the woman who needed rescuing, had its reasons. Then hope moved, a firm, deliberate kick against Claire's palm. "Okay," Claire said. "Yes, please." Scott opened his briefcase. He pulled out a legal pad the size of a small country. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Leave nothing out." Rachel stood up from her chair and stretched. She looked at Scott's legal pad. She looked at Claire. She looked at Scott. "You're going to need a bigger pad," she said. For the next 2 hours, Claire talked. Scott wrote. James sat in a chair by the window, not crowding, not commenting, just present. A quiet and steady presence in the way that certain things are steady. Bedrock, weight-bearing walls. When Claire finished, Scott closed his pad. "This is solid," he said. "The security footage from the neighbor's camera gives us the push on video. The medical records document the pattern of abuse over time. The financial fraud with the credit cards adds motive and control. We have a strong case." "He'll say I'm lying," Claire said. "He always does." Scott looked at her with the expression of a man who had heard that before. "Let him," Scott said. "We have the video." After Scott left to make calls, James moved his chair closer to the bed. He did not touch her. He did not try to fix anything. He just sat and looked at her and said, "Why did you really leave me? 5 years ago?" Claire looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "Because I was terrified of how much I loved you," she said finally. "That is the most embarrassing sentence I have ever said out loud." James was quiet. Then he said, "You should know that I never stopped. Whatever else happened, whatever comes next, I never stopped." Claire closed her eyes. Outside the window, Christmas evening was settling over the city, the lights coming on in windows. The whole vast ordinary miracle of people safe inside their homes. Somewhere out there, Nathan Cole was at his mother's house, being defended and coddled and prepared for the performance ahead. Somewhere in this hospital, a tiny girl named Hope was existing with tremendous determination. And in this room, 2 people who had lost 5 years to fear and pride and terrible choices sat in the particular silence of people who might, against all reasonable expectation, get a second chance. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight there was only survival. But for the first time in 4 years, that felt like it might be enough to build something on. The arrest happened at 6 in the morning, while Claire was sleeping. Detective Foster had waited until Claire was sedated, waited until the night had done its quiet work. And then she had taken 3 officers to Margaret Cole's Tudor Revival in New Jersey and knocked on the door. Nathan Cole had answered in a bathrobe. He had looked at the officers with the particular expression of a man who believed, right up until the handcuffs clicked, that he was going to talk his way out of this. He had not talked his way out of this. Foster told Claire in the morning, arriving with coffee and bagels like a person delivering ordinary news. 6 this morning, Foster said, setting a coffee on Claire's rolling table. He's being processed now. Arraignment this afternoon. Claire absorbed this. She had known it was coming. Knowing and hearing were different things. What did he say? Claire asked. The usual, Foster said. Her voice was professionally neutral, in the way that meant she had opinions she was choosing not to share. Denied everything. Said you were unstable. Said you jumped and he tried to grab you but couldn't reach in time. Claire looked at her coffee. People will believe that, she said. Some will, Foster agreed. We're releasing the security footage today, coordinating with the DA's office. Claire looked up. What does that mean for me? It means the world is going to see exactly what happened on that balcony, Foster said, in clear, unambiguous detail. It also means everyone is going to see your face, your pain, the moment of it. It'll be on every channel by tonight. Are you prepared for that? No, Claire thought. Out loud she said, do it. The footage aired that evening. Claire did not watch it. Rachel watched it for her, described it with clinical precision, because Rachel understood that Claire needed the information without the re-experiencing. Nathan's hand on her back, Rachel said. Clear as anything. Your face turning, then the push, then you reaching for the railing and missing. The whole thing is about 4 seconds. 4 seconds. 4 seconds, Claire said. The internet was exactly what the internet always was. Half the comments were outrage on her behalf. Half were variations of, she's lying, she jumped, she's after the money being James Whitmore, whose name and net worth had been attached to the story by the third hour. Rachel read her the worst one out loud. She obviously staged the whole thing to land on the billionaire's car on purpose. Claire stared at her. She fell, Rachel told the ceiling, from a 5th-floor balcony. While pregnant, on purpose, to land on a specific car. I know, Claire said. The geometry alone, Rachel said. I know. Rachel put the phone away. She looked at Claire with the expression that meant something real was coming. He's going to make bail, Rachel said. You know that. Claire knew that. Margaret will pay it, Claire said. Rachel nodded. So, we need to talk about where you go when you're discharged. The answer to that question arrived the next morning in the form of James Whitmore, who appeared in her hospital room with the specific energy of a person who has made a decision and is presenting it as information rather than a negotiation. I have a guest house on my property in Westchester, James said. Separate entrance, full security system, private, safe. Claire opened her mouth. Before you say no, James said, consider that the alternative is the apartment Nathan can access, a shelter with limited resources, or Megan's studio, which she noted is too small. Rachel's name is Rachel, Claire said. Right, James said. Rachel. Rachel in the corner raised her hand. Hi, I'm not saying it has to be permanent, James said. Just until after the trial, until you're safe. I can't pay you, Claire said. I'm not asking for payment. I'll pay you back. Every cent. When I'm working again. James looked at her with the expression she remembered from 5 years ago. The one that said he found her simultaneously admirable and exasperating in equal measure. Fine, he said. Now can we stop arguing about money? Nathan made bail 4 days later. $500,000. Margaret put up her house. The ankle monitor was fitted. The restraining order was issued. He could not come within 500 feet of Claire. He could not contact her directly. Scott delivered this news with the tone of a man who believed in the justice system while being personally irritated by it. The judge considered him low flight risk, Scott said. He pushed his pregnant wife off a balcony, Claire said. I know, Scott said. And he's low flight risk. The ankle monitor limits his movement significantly, and any violation goes directly back to the judge. Claire thought about pointing out that a man who planned a murder while appearing to buy baby books and discuss nursery colors was not a man who would be deterred by an ankle monitor. She thought about it, and then she let it go, because she was learning to save her energy for the fights she could win. She moved to James's guest house 2 days later. The property was in Westchester, up winding roads that smelled like pine and distance from everything that had happened. The guest house was small, 800 square feet, warm wood and white walls and windows that looked into trees rather than other people's apartments. There was a nursery. Claire stood in the doorway of the nursery for a long time. The crib was white. The walls were pale yellow. There was a rocking chair in the corner that looked like it had been placed there by someone who thought carefully about where a rocking chair should go. The changing table had a pad that was exactly the right thickness. "Did you?" Claire started. "I had it prepared," James said from behind her. "When I knew you were coming." "Is it too much?" Claire could not speak for a moment. "It's perfect," she finally managed. "Thank you." James showed her the security system, the panic button beside the bed, the direct line to the main house. He showed her the camera feeds, the gate code, the procedure for everything. He was thorough and practical and kept his voice in the registers of someone giving a briefing, which she understood was his way of giving her space to absorb the generosity without having to respond to it emotionally. When he was done, Rachel, who had followed them through the tour in her characteristic way of occupying space without being asked, looked at James and said, "You prepared a nursery yesterday." James said, "Yes." Rachel said, "Yesterday." James, "Is there an issue with the timeline?" Rachel, to Claire, "Marry him immediately." Claire did not marry him immediately. She stood in the guest house after James and Rachel left, in the silence that was different from the silence of the Brooklyn apartment, this silence having texture and depth rather than the held breath quality of a place where something bad might happen at any moment. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She answered because she did not know not to yet. "You have nothing," Nathan's voice said. "You'll have nothing. I'll make sure of it." Her hands went cold. She called Detective Foster. Foster arrived within the hour, collected the phone, documented the call. "This is a restraining order violation," Foster said. "This goes to the judge." "Could," Claire said. "Mais it?" "Maybe." Foster looked at her. "I know how this feels. The system is slow." The judge reviewed it. The judge issued a warning. Claire sat in the kitchen of the guest house that night and thought about what a warning meant to a man who had spent 4 years teaching her that warnings were just delays. The next morning, Scott arrived with documents that changed the texture of everything. The financial audit of Nathan's accounts had turned up things. Scott laid them on the kitchen table with the careful hands of someone who understood that paper could be a kind of violence. The first document, a life insurance policy on Claire, taken out 6 months ago, right after the positive pregnancy test, $1 million, double payout for accidental death. Claire read it twice. "He was planning this," she said, "before I was even showing. There's more." Scott said. The second document was worse. Nathan had drafted paperwork to have Claire committed to a psychiatric facility after the birth. He had a doctor arranged, someone willing to sign off on a finding of postpartum psychosis and suicidal ideation. The plan had been documented in emails between Nathan and the doctor. Declare Claire unfit, assume full custody of the baby, position himself as the devoted father, managing a deeply troubled wife, and collect the insurance, and disappear with someone named Kayla Morris, who turned out to be Nathan's administrative assistant, with whom he had been conducting an affair for 2 years. Claire read the documents. She read them again. "He never," she said. She stopped. "He never loved me," she said. Scott was quiet. "Not once. It was always," she stopped again. "It was always about what I was useful for, and then what I was worth when I was gone." Scott said, "I'm sorry." Claire sat with that for a moment. The smallness of it. The absolute waste of it. 4 years. A baby. A balcony. "Add it to the case," she said. Scott nodded. "Already done. The DA is adding charges. Conspiracy, fraud, attempted kidnapping for the custody plan. He's looking at serious time." Claire looked out the window at the trees. "I want him to stand in front of a jury," she said. "I want 12 people who have never met either of us to hear everything he did and decide. I want a verdict." Scott closed his briefcase. "Then let's build one," he said. That night, alone in the guest house, with hope moving against her palm, and the security system armed, and the trees outside the window keeping their patient watch, Claire made a list. Not of what she had lost, not of what Nathan had taken. She made a list of what she still had. Her daughter, alive and fighting. Rachel, who showed up, a detective who believed her, a lawyer building a case, a man who had prepared a nursery in a day and asked for nothing. The truth, which she was finally telling. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, enough. Margaret Cole held her first press conference on a Tuesday. Claire found out via Rachel, who texted at 7:45 in the morning with, "Turn on Channel 4. Now." "I'm so sorry." Claire turned on Channel 4. Margaret stood on the steps of her Tudor revival in the kind of winter coat that costs more than most people's car payments, flanked by two of Nathan's attorneys and a young woman in a conservative navy dress, with her hair pulled back and her hands folded and her eyes slightly red. The young woman was Kayla Morris, 27 years old, Nathan's administrative assistant, the person he had been texting on Christmas Eve. "Problem handled tonight, tomorrow we're free." Margaret spoke first. "My son," Margaret said, her voice carrying the particular resonance of a woman who had spent decades speaking in rooms where she expected to be heard, "is a devoted husband and father who has been falsely accused by a deeply troubled young woman." She described Claire's supposed history of depression. She described Nathan's supposed heroism in managing Claire's instability throughout the pregnancy. She described, in careful and sympathetic detail, a version of Christmas morning in which Claire had been standing on the balcony railing, and Nathan had reached for her, and she had fallen before he could pull her back. Then Kayla spoke. "I didn't know Claire existed," Kayla said, and her voice was steady enough that Claire could not immediately tell if the tears in her eyes were real. "Nathan told me he was separated. Divorced for 2 years, he showed me paperwork." She paused. She looked directly at the camera. "I was deceived," she said. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I'm a victim of his lies, too." Then, very quietly, "Derek is the real victim here." Rachel, who was watching the press conference over the phone with Claire, said absolutely nothing for 4 full seconds. Then she said, "She called him Derek." "I know," Claire said. "His name is Nathan. I noticed." She said Derek. "Rachel," Claire said, "she's either lying or she doesn't actually know his name," Rachel said. "Either way." It was funny. It was also not funny. It was the specific combination of absurd and terrible that defined this entire chapter of Claire's life. The press conference cut to coverage of the security footage, the clips that had gone viral 3 days earlier, then to speculation about James Whitmore, then to a graphic showing James's estimated net worth. Rachel was reading comments out loud now because she believed in full information delivery, regardless of emotional cost. She says, "Nathan is the real victim," Rachel read. "This guy in the comments says Claire obviously planned to land on the billionaire's car." Another guy agrees. They're having a very supportive conversation about it. Claire said, "Please stop. This woman says you're her hero. This one says you're lying. This one is just the fire emoji repeated 40 times, which I choose to interpret as supportive." "Rachel," Claire said. "Okay," Rachel said. "Done." She put the phone face down. The real damage from the press conference was not the comments. The real damage was the jury pool. The phrase reasonable doubt was doing work in the public conversation that it was not supposed to do until an actual courtroom. Scott walked Claire through it that afternoon. "They're building a narrative," Scott said. "Unstable woman, devoted husband, wealthy ex with motive to destroy a rival. It's coherent. It's wrong, but it's coherent." "What do we do?" Claire asked. "We release the financial documents," Scott said. "Not all of them. The insurance policy. Timed correctly, it reframes the entire story. A man who secretly insured his pregnant wife for $1 million 2 weeks after she got pregnant is not a man who tried to save her. Will it work? Claire asked. It will complicate their narrative significantly, Scott said, which in a trial is the same thing. 3 days after the press conference, Detective Foster called. We have Kayla Morris's phone records, Foster said. And, Claire said, she's cooperating, Foster said, fully. Once she saw the Christmas Eve texts in context, she realized. She has emails, personal emails, where Nathan described his plan for the insurance money, where he described Claire as the last obstacle. Claire absorbed this. The last obstacle, she said. Foster was quiet for a moment. He used those words, Foster said. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Claire said. Use it. Foster used it. The information hit the news cycle the following morning. Kayla Morris, previously presented by Margaret's team as a sympathetic second victim, had provided evidence of premeditated murder for financial gain. The insurance policy followed hours later, released by the DA's office with Scott's coordination. By the evening news, the public narrative had shifted. Rachel sent a text that said, "The fire emojis are now entirely in your favor." Claire was lying in bed, in the guest house, when she read it. She was 33 weeks pregnant. Her pelvis ached. Her ribs ached. Hope was doing something in there that felt like auditions for a competitive dance program. She smiled at her phone. James knocked on the guest house door at 7, holding a bag from a Thai place Rachel had recommended, and they ate at the small kitchen table and talked about something completely unrelated to any of it, which was the best conversation Claire had had in months. James told her about a tech startup he was funding, something to do with accessible, clean energy. And he talked about it the way he talked about everything that interested him, with the specific pleasure of someone who had found a problem worth solving. Claire listened. She asked questions. She had forgotten that she was good at asking questions. At some point, James said, "You know, you're the only person who's ever made me explain myself clearly." Most people just nod. Claire said, "Most people are intimidated by you." James looked at her. "Are you?" "Not anymore," Claire said. It was a small moment. Nothing happened. They finished their food. James cleaned up with the efficiency of a man who did not leave messes, and he left with a quiet goodnight and the same respectful distance he had maintained since the hospital. But Claire sat at the table after he left and understood something she had not understood clearly before. She had not run from James because she was not good enough for his world. She had run because she was afraid of wanting something that much, afraid of how much it would hurt to lose it. And in running from that fear, she had walked directly into the thing she was most afraid of. She thought about saying this out loud to someone. She thought about saying it to Rachel, who would deliver commentary, or to her therapist, who she had not yet met because that appointment was scheduled for next week. Instead, she said it quietly to the kitchen, to the warm wood and white walls, to the house that someone had prepared for her in a single day. "I was afraid of the wrong things," she said. The house did not disagree. 2 days later, Nathan violated the restraining order again. He called James's office. He left a message with James's receptionist, asking for photographs of the baby, invoking parental rights, speaking in the measured, reasonable voice of a man performing sanity for a recording. The call was documented. The recording was logged. The violation report was filed. The judge issued another warning. Claire sat across from Scott in James's kitchen and looked at the warning documentation. "Another warning," she said. Scott looked tired in the way that lawyers who believed in justice sometimes looked tired. "I know. How many warnings does he get?" Claire said. "We're building a pattern file," Scott said. "Every violation strengthens the case for extended sentencing. Every violation proves ongoing threat and predatory behavior. Every—" "Scott," Claire said. Scott stopped. "I understand," she said. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just telling you that I understand what this means. He will keep pushing, right up to the moment the jury says guilty, maybe after. Scott met her eyes. Yes. So I need to be ready for a long time of this. Yes. Claire nodded. Then let's make sure the verdict is worth the wait, she said. Scott closed his folder. That, he said, I can absolutely guarantee. Hope was born at 4:17 in the morning, on a Tuesday in January, in the middle of a snowstorm, because she had apparently inherited her mother's timing. The contractions had started at 2 a.m., stronger than the Braxton Hicks that had been coming and going for a week. Different in the way that real things are different from rehearsals. Claire had known immediately. She had timed 3 contractions, 6 minutes apart, and then she had called James. He answered on the first ring. Labor, she said. He said, 10 minutes. He made it in 5. He came through the guest house door in whatever he had been wearing when the phone rang, which appeared to be jeans and a sweater that was on inside out. And Claire clocked this detail and stored it somewhere private. The drive to the hospital was fast. James broke 3 red lights and 1 social contract about appropriate speed on residential streets. Are you timing them? He said. 4 minutes apart, Claire said between breaths. You can slow down. No, James said. The light is red. I see it, James said, and went through it. You're going to get us pulled over. Scott knows traffic attorneys, James said. It was, Claire would later tell Rachel, the funniest thing anyone had ever said to her while she was in active labor. She laughed, which hurt, and then contracted, which hurt worse, and James reached over without looking away from the road and put his hand over hers for exactly 4 seconds, then both hands back on the wheel. Focused. She remembered the warmth of it. The hospital was ready for them. James had called ahead. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, Claire's obstetrician, met them at the emergency entrance in jeans and a sweater, hair in a quick ponytail, carrying the particular calm of someone who had done this enough times to know that calm was the most useful thing she could bring. Let's have a baby, Dr. Reynolds said. Labor lasted 4 hours. Claire would not describe those 4 hours as beautiful because she believed in accuracy, but she would say that they were the most concentrated experience of being completely and entirely present she had ever had. There was no past in those 4 hours. There was no Nathan, no trial, no press conferences, no insurance policy. There was only this work, this effort, this small, fierce person deciding she was ready. Hope arrived at 4:17. 4 pounds, 9 ounces, 17 inches. The most determined 4 pounds 9 ounces Claire had ever encountered. She screamed immediately, which, Dr. Reynolds said, was excellent. And then they placed her on Claire's chest, skin to skin, and Claire looked at her daughter for 30 seconds. That felt like a different kind of time, thick and golden and complete. Then the NICU team took her. Too small, too early, needed help with temperature regulation, with feeding, with the basic work of existing outside a womb that had itself been through considerable trauma. Claire watched them carry her daughter away. Her arms went empty. James was in the doorway. He had not left. She had told him he did not have to stay, and he had stayed anyway, in the waiting room. And now he was in the doorway of the delivery room, looking at the space where Hope had just been. She's beautiful, he said quietly. Claire could not speak. She nodded. James crossed the room. He stood beside the bed, and he did not say anything comforting or optimistic or well-meaning, because he was smart enough to know that none of those things were what she needed. He just stood there, present, solid, a person who was not going anywhere. Claire named her that morning. It had been her name since Christmas, the name Claire had chosen while making pancakes and hiding bruises. She told the nurse, and the nurse wrote it in the file. Hope Harrington Cole. Not for long, Claire thought. The Cole was temporary. Everything Nathan had put his name on was temporary. Rachel arrived at 7. She appeared in the doorway with a balloon that said, "It's a girl," and a look of fierce, controlled emotion. She sat beside Claire and held her hand. "She's in the NICU," Claire said. "I know. I already went by. I have hospital privileges." She looked at me with Nathan's eyes and your stubbornness, which is the best combination. Claire squeezed Rachel's hand. "She's going to be okay," Rachel said. "And then, you're going to be okay." "I know," Claire said. She meant it, which surprised her. 3 days later, Scott arrived with the documents that proved, if any further proof were needed, that Nathan Cole was a particular kind of evil that Claire did not have an adequate word for. He had taken out a second insurance policy. Not on Claire, on Hope, filed 2 weeks before Christmas, before the push. He had looked at the child he claimed was a trap, the child he claimed he had never wanted, and he had calculated her worth, and he had filed the paperwork. Claire sat with this information for a long time. The kitchen of the guest house was very quiet. Outside the window, January was doing what January did, relentless and gray. "He had a number for her," Claire said finally. Scott said nothing. "Before she was born, he had a number for what she was worth." Scott said, "Yes." Claire stood up from the table. She walked to the window. She stood there, with her back to Scott, looking out at the trees. She had thought she was past the capacity for new grief about Nathan. She had thought she had reached the bottom of it, had mapped its full dimensions, knew its shape. She had been wrong. This was a new room, smaller and colder than anything she had found before. "Add it to the sentencing report," Claire said. Scott said, "Already done." She turned around. Nathan had been rearrested 3 days earlier, she had learned, for violating the restraining order by appearing at the hospital, demanding to see his daughter, making a scene that security footage captured in full. The judge, finally, had revoked bail. Nathan was in a cell, and the ankle monitor was gone because he no longer needed one. He would stay there until trial. "Good," Claire had said when Foster told her. It felt like the least possible, adequate response, but it was all she had. She visited Hope every day, twice a day, driving from the guest house to the hospital, and sitting beside the isolette and putting her hands through the portholes to touch her daughter's silk-warm skin. Hope gained weight with the same determination she had shown in arriving. 2 ounces the first week, 3 the next. She wrapped her fingers around Claire's finger and held on in a way that felt like communication. "I'm here," that grip said. "I'm not going anywhere." "Neither am I," Claire said out loud, quiet enough that only the two of them could hear. The trial date was set for April, 3 months away. Scott and Claire met 3 times a week to prepare, going through every detail of 4 years of marriage, building the timeline, documenting the pattern, preparing Claire for the cross-examination that would try to take every truth she knew and make it look like something else. James appeared regularly with food and the kind of quiet company that did not require anything. One evening, sitting at the kitchen table, after Scott had left and Rachel had gone home and the house was quiet, James said, "I want to tell you something." "Okay," Claire said. "I dated a lot of people after you left," he said. He was looking at his coffee. "Good people. Interesting people. I tried." He looked up. "None of it worked, and I didn't understand why for a long time." Claire waited. "I think I understand now," James said. "I think I was always measuring everything against something I thought I had imagined. The way things were with you, I thought I had inflated it in my memory the way you do." Claire said nothing. I hadn't, James said simply. I had remembered it correctly. He did not say anything else. He did not reach for her hand, or move closer, or add an if you ever want, or a someday at the end. He just said the true thing and let it sit there between them. Claire looked at him for a long moment. James? She said. Yeah, I'm not ready. I know, he said, but I'm getting there. He nodded. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. They sat in comfortable silence while outside the window, January moved slowly toward February, and hope grew stronger in her isolette across town, and the trial moved closer with the inevitable patience of things that could not be stopped. Only started. Mock trial began on a Thursday in February, in James's dining room, with Scott playing the defense attorney and Rachel playing an extremely unhelpful but emotionally accurate version of the judge. Scott had warned Claire it would be difficult. Difficult, Claire said after the first session, sitting with an ice pack on her neck from the tension. That's one word for it. Let's go again, Scott said. From the beginning, Claire said. From the push, Scott said. Claire closed her eyes. Opened them. Okay, she said. The questions were designed to do what the defense would actually do, which was to take every true thing Claire knew about her own life and hold it at an angle until it looked like something else. Scott playing defense. You claim to have been terrified of my client for 4 years, yet you got pregnant, stayed pregnant, moved into a billionaire's guest house hours after he offered. That sounds less like terror and more like strategy. Claire, at first. That's not what happened. Scott. Try again, he said, out of character for a moment. Don't defend. Explain, Claire. Leaving is when they kill you. I know that sounds extreme, but it's documented. Women leaving abusive relationships are at the highest statistical risk of homicide in the weeks immediately following separation. I wasn't staying because I wanted to. I was staying because I was calculating the window. Scott nodded. Better. They went through the pregnancy, the financial control. The first time Nathan had grabbed her arm, 3 months into dating, which she had explained away because she had needed an explanation. Here's what I know now, Claire said during one session, and Scott stopped her. That, he said, what you just said. That's the moment in testimony where you stop defending yourself and you speak to the jury directly. That sentence. Write it down and say it exactly like that. Claire wrote it down. She practiced it in the mirror in the guest house bathroom, the way she had once practiced a different kind of sentence. Years ago, she had practiced, I fell, I'm clumsy, the baby makes me unbalanced. Now she practiced the truth, and the truth fit differently in her mouth. More room to it, cleaner lines. Rachel attended the mock trial sessions when her shifts allowed. Her role, officially, was to observe and provide feedback. Unofficially, her role was to maintain the humanity of the room. On a Thursday in March, Scott asked a particularly brutal question about why Claire had not left after the first slap, 3 years into the marriage. Claire answered it clearly and correctly, explaining coercive control, financial dependence, isolation, the way the architecture of abuse is specifically designed to make leaving feel impossible. When she finished, Rachel said, that was perfect. Scott said, the defense will ask it differently. They'll ask, why didn't you go to a shelter? Why didn't you call a hotline? Why didn't you tell your friend? They'll make the jury think you had options you chose not to take. I told Rachel, Claire said. I told her to stay quiet. I thought I could manage it. Say that, Scott said. Exactly that. I told the one person I trusted, and I asked her to stay quiet because I thought I could manage it. That's not hiding. That's surviving. Rachel, from across the table, I stayed quiet. For 2 years. I want the record to note that I hate myself for it. You did what I asked, Claire said. I should have pushed harder. You couldn't have made me leave before I was ready, Claire said. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. It was the thing she kept coming back to, in therapy every Tuesday, in the long, quiet evenings in the guest house, in the occasional calls with the domestic violence advocate the DA's office had connected her with. The question everyone wanted answered, why didn't you leave sooner? She had been asked it in the mock trial a dozen times. She had a dozen different answers that were all, at their root, the same answer. Because I was surviving, Claire said. That's it. That's the whole answer. I was surviving the way you survive when you're in the middle of something that doesn't look from inside it the way it looks from outside. The advocate, a woman named Diane, who had worked domestic violence cases for 20 years, had told Claire something that lodged in her and would not leave. The question everyone should be asking, Diane said, is not why didn't she leave? The question is, why did he do it? Why did he get to keep hurting her for 4 years and face no consequences until she fell 5 stories? That's the question. That's the whole question. Claire had thought about that conversation for a long time. She thought about it in February and March, in the growing warmth that was almost spring, as hope grew and gained weight and began to smile in the particular crooked way that was, Rachel insisted, entirely Claire's expression on a smaller face. She thought about it on the days when she sat in the NICU and watched her daughter exist with such committed determination and thought about the second insurance policy, the number Nathan had put on this small specific life. She thought about it on the evenings when James brought dinner and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with courts or lawyers or any of it. And Claire felt herself slowly, incrementally, becoming a person who laughed regularly and meant it. On a Tuesday in late February, she told her therapist about James. Her therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Coleman, whose office had a very good lamp and the most neutral expression Claire had ever encountered on a human face, listened carefully. "You're afraid of wanting it too much," Dr. Coleman said. "I've been afraid of that before," Claire said. "It didn't work out." "You've also learned a considerable amount since then," Dr. Coleman said, "about what you deserve, about what real care looks like versus what you were trained to accept." Claire thought about this. "He prepared a nursery in a day and didn't mention it until I saw it," she said. "That's care," Dr. Coleman said. "He says he's not waiting," Claire said. "He says he's just living his life, and it keeps ending up next to mine." Dr. Coleman looked at her. "How does that make you feel?" Dr. Coleman said. "Like I want to be ready faster," Claire said, "which I know is the wrong approach." "The right approach is to let the readiness develop naturally," Dr. Coleman said, "and to note that you just described a man's patience as something that makes you want to rush. That's quite different from how you described Nathan's pursuit early on." Claire thought about that for a long time after she left the office. Nathan had been relentless, urgent, always pulling her forward, faster, more. Now, the pressure of him that she had read as passion and that she now understood was control. James had a guest house ready and said only, "When you're ready, if you're ready." The difference between those two approaches was the difference between a tide and a trap. She went home. Hope was with Rachel for the afternoon, Rachel's day off, which meant Hope was being introduced to what Rachel described as the fundamental building blocks of human culture, meaning 90s romantic comedies and competitive food, delivery, ordering. Claire sat in the quiet guest house. She picked up her phone. She typed a text to James. "Thank you for the nursery. I don't think I said it properly before." His reply came in 4 minutes. "You said it fine." Claire, "I was in shock." James, "That seemed reasonable given the circumstances." Claire, "I'm not in shock anymore." A longer pause. James, "Good." Claire put her phone down. Outside the window, the last of winter was making its argument and losing. Something was changing in the quality of the light. The trial was 6 weeks away. She was ready. The courthouse was everything a courthouse was supposed to be. Marble columns, high ceilings. The particular weight of authority made architectural. Claire had walked past it 100 times in her life without ever thinking she would stand on these steps with a lawyer on one side and a best friend on the other, and camera lenses tracking her face for the reaction shot. Scott walked beside her. Rachel was on her other side. James had come, but stayed at the car because appearing publicly beside Claire at the trial entrance would hand the defense exactly the image they wanted. "We'll get there," James had said at the guest house that morning before any of them left. "Whatever comes today." Claire had looked at him. "I know," she had said. She had meant it. Inside the courtroom, wood paneling, the jury box to the left, the judge's bench elevated with the intention of suggesting that human judgment could be elevated above human messiness, which Claire found optimistic. The gallery was full. She did not look at it directly. She looked at the defense table. Nathan sat in a suit his mother had probably selected, dark blue, conservative, the suit of a reasonable man being unreasonably accused. His lawyers flanked him, expensive and assured. Nathan himself looked thinner than the last time she had seen him, which had been the morning he put his hands on her shoulders and pried her fingers from a doorframe. He looked at her when she walked in. He smiled, small, private, the smile that meant he knew something she didn't. She looked away. She looked at the jury box, empty today, filling tomorrow. 12 people who did not know her. 12 people who would hear everything. She thought about the 4 years she had spent making herself smaller so Nathan would not be threatened, adjusting her voice, her opinions, her friendships, her career, her sense of her own reality to fit inside the space he designated for her. She was done being small. Jury selection took 2 days. Scott and the prosecution worked through dozens of potential jurors, excusing those who had already formed opinions from the news coverage, finding 12 who could, by the standard they were all pretending was reliable, be impartial. 6 women, 6 men, a range of ages, backgrounds, expressions. Claire looked at each of them and thought, "You are going to hear my life. You are going to hear 4 years of it, and you are going to decide if it is true." She hoped they were ready. She knew she was. Opening statements began on the 3rd day. The prosecutor, a woman named Assistant DA Catherine Walsh, who wore her authority like something she had earned rather than been assigned, laid out the case with precision. "The evidence will show," Walsh said, "that Nathan Cole did not push his wife off a balcony in a moment of rage. The evidence will show that he planned it. 6 months of planning, a life insurance policy, psychiatric commitment papers, a mistress he had promised the money to. This was not a tragedy. This was a business decision." The defense's opening was delivered by Nathan's lead attorney, a man named Bradley Fitch, who had the smooth delivery of someone who had spent 40 years convincing people of things. Claire Harrington, Fitch said, carefully using her maiden name, was a woman in crisis, overwhelmed by pregnancy, battling depression she had hidden from her husband. A woman who had a history, well documented, of impulsive decisions. He looked at the jury. "My client," Fitch said, "loved his wife. He reached for her on that balcony. He was not fast enough. And now he sits here, charged with attempted murder, while the woman he tried to save has found her way back to the wealthy man she left him for." Claire kept her face still. She had practiced keeping her face still for exactly this. The first week of testimony was prosecution witnesses. Detective Foster, methodical and clear. Dr. Reynolds, clinical and devastating. The neighbor who had provided the security footage, who described the morning with the particularity of someone who had replayed it many times in their own head. The footage itself played in the courtroom on a screen that everyone could see. Claire looked at her hands while it played. She had seen it once, alone on her phone at 2 in the morning, 2 weeks after the fall. She had needed to see it then, needed the evidence to confirm what her own memory already knew. She did not need to see it again. The reactions from the gallery, though, she heard those, the sharp intake of breath, the quiet that followed, the quality of silence that means people have seen something that has shifted their understanding. Then week 2, the defense's turn. Nathan's colleagues, who testified to his good character, his friends, who spoke of a patient and devoted husband managing a difficult pregnancy. A psychiatrist the defense had retained, who spoke clinically about postpartum depression and suicidal ideation and the ways that trauma can create false or distorted memories. Margaret testified on Thursday of the second week. She was composed and devastating in the way of people who have spent their entire lives being composed in public. She cried at the appropriate moment. She spoke of her son with the unshakable conviction of a woman who had decided that her conviction made her right. Claire sat at the prosecution's table and watched Margaret perform grief and thought about the bruise Margaret had seen on Claire's wrist at their first Christmas together, the one Margaret had looked at and then looked away from. Looking away was its own kind of choice. Then Kayla Morris testified. She did not do what the defense had expected. Kayla Morris was 27 years old and had been deceived for 2 years by a man who had told her he was separated, who had shown her fraudulent divorce paperwork, who had promised her a future funded by money he was planning to take from the death of his pregnant wife. She knew all of this now. She had known it for months, and she had made a decision, sitting across from Detective Foster in an interview room in January, about what kind of person she wanted to be. She had cooperated, fully, completely, without reservation. On the stand, she described every text, every email, every conversation in which Nathan had referred to Claire as the situation, the obstacle, the problem he was solving. She described the Christmas Eve text, "Problem handled tonight. Tomorrow we're free." She described how she had felt when she read that text in context, how she had sat in Detective Foster's office and understood, all at once, what the man she had thought she loved had been capable of, and what she had almost been a part of. The courtroom was very quiet when Kayla finished. Nathan's attorney tried to rattle her on cross-examination. She was not rattled. She was a woman who had made a decision about what kind of person she wanted to be, and she had made it, and there was nothing left to rattle. Later that evening, in the guest house, Rachel described the moment Kayla left the stand. She walked past the defense table, Rachel said, and Nathan looked at her, and she just looked straight ahead. Claire thought about this. He lost everyone, Claire said. He built his whole plan on using people, and he lost all of them. Rachel said, "The loneliness of the truly selfish." They sat with that for a moment. James arrived with dinner. He had been at the trial every day, in the gallery, without drawing attention to himself, which was a skill in itself. He set the bags on the kitchen table and looked at Claire's face. "How are you?" he said. "I testify tomorrow," Claire said. "I know. I'm ready." James looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I think you are." Rachel from the table. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life, and it's not even my testimony." James looked at Rachel. "Do you want a role in the proceedings?" Rachel considered this seriously. "Can I be in the gallery and react audibly?" "Absolutely not," Scott said from the kitchen doorway, having arrived silently at some point in the last 30 seconds in the manner of lawyers who believe in punctuality. "I'll be subtle," Rachel said. "You were not subtle today when Kayla testified," Scott said. "I felt that reaction was appropriate to the moment." Scott looked at Claire. "She is not allowed to react audibly." "I know," Claire said. She smiled. She was smiling again, she realized. In the middle of all of it, in the eye of everything. Sitting at a kitchen table with people who showed up on the night before she would stand in a courtroom and tell the truth in front of the world. It was not the life she had planned. It was not anything she had planned. It was, against all available evidence, a good evening. Tomorrow, she would testify. Tonight, she would eat her dinner and listen to Rachel argue with Scott about the definition of subtle, and feel hope move against her palm in the carrier she was wearing, solid and warm and here. That was enough. She walked to the witness stand on a Thursday morning in April and sat down and raised her right hand and said the words, and then she looked at the courtroom. The jury, 12 people with notebooks and pens, and the expressions of people who were paying very careful attention. The gallery. Rachel in the third row, hands folded, face controlled. James near the back, still as stone. Nathan at the defense table, looking at her with the flat attention of a man calculating. She looked away from Nathan. She had decided, in the preparation, to look at the jury when she spoke and nowhere else. The jury was the only audience that mattered. Scott stood at the podium. "Mrs. Cole," Scott said. "Can you tell the jury how you and Nathan Cole met?" "I was 28, Claire said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this. "I was working as a marketing executive. Nathan was a client at my firm. He was charming and attentive, and he pursued me very persistently." She walked through the beginning of it. The dating, the engagement, the wedding that happened fast because Nathan preferred things that happened fast. Because speed was a control mechanism. She described the first year of marriage, the first time he grabbed her arm, the way she had explained it to herself. She described the second year, the escalation, the first slap, the apology, the promise, the next time. She described the third year, the complete isolation, no job because Nathan had quietly sabotaged every interview by calling her references and reporting concerns about her mental stability. No money of her own, no friendships. Nathan had not approved. She described the fourth year, the pregnancy, the hope she had allowed herself, the way hope can be its own kind of trap. She described Christmas morning. The jury listened. Some of them were taking notes, some were watching Nathan, some were watching her. She kept her eyes moving across the 12 faces, making contact, making the story personal. She described the balcony. She described the push. She described the fall with the same careful clarity she had described everything else, not sparing herself the specificity of it, because specificity was credibility, and credibility was everything. When she finished, the courtroom was very quiet. Scott said, "Thank you, Mrs. Cole." No further questions. Bradley Fitch rose. He was pleasant when he approached. That was always the tell. Claire had learned in the preparation. When they were pleasant at the beginning, they were planning something. "Mrs. Cole," Fitch said, "you stated that you were afraid of my client throughout your marriage." "Yes," Claire said. "Yet you got pregnant," Fitch said. "You maintained the pregnancy. You continued to live in the marital home. You made Christmas breakfast on the morning in question. That doesn't sound like terror?" Claire looked at him steadily. "It sounds exactly like terror," she said. "In my experience, and in the documented experience of millions of women in similar situations, maintaining the routines of normal life is how you manage proximity to someone dangerous. You make the breakfast, you set the table, you behave normally, because disrupting normal is the thing that sets them off." Fitch made a note on his pad. "And the pregnancy," he said, "was that planned?" "No," Claire said, "but you chose to continue it." "Yes, even knowing, you claim, that your husband was abusive." "I chose to continue it," Claire said, "because she was mine. She was my daughter. And I made a decision that her life was worth more than my fear. I was right about that." She's here. Fitch pivoted. Let's talk about James Whitmore, he said. Claire waited. You have known Mr. Whitmore for approximately 7 years. Yes. You had a romantic relationship with him prior to your marriage. Yes. You are currently living on his property. Yes. He has provided you with legal representation, housing, and financial support. Yes. And he is, by most estimates, a billionaire. I would assume so, Claire said. I've never asked him to verify that. A small sound from the gallery. Not quite laughter. Close enough. Mrs. Cole, Fitch said, and his voice sharpened slightly, isn't it possible that your return to Mr. Whitmore's sphere of influence is not coincidental? That landing on his car represented an opportunity you chose to pursue. Claire looked at him. She had prepared for this one specifically. She and Scott had gone through it 15 times. She looked past Fitch to the jury. I fell from a 5th-floor balcony while 7 months pregnant, she said. I hit a car going at a speed that should have killed me and my daughter. I survived because of the angle of the car, the physics of the impact, and what I can only call luck. If you are suggesting that I calculated the trajectory of a fall from 5 stories up in order to land on a specific car belonging to a specific person, I genuinely do not know what to say to you, except, I am good at marketing, but I am not that good. The silence in the courtroom was different this time. Fitch made another note. He continued for another hour. The questions were professionally cruel, designed to reframe every truth as calculation, every survival decision as strategy. She answered each one. She remembered what Scott had told her. Don't defend. Explain. She explained. When Fitch sat down, Scott stood. Just one follow-up, Scott said. Mrs. Cole, Bradley Fitch suggested that you might have, quote, pursued an opportunity, unquote, when you contacted James Whitmore after the fall. Fitch actually said that Claire contacted Whitmore first, Claire said. Scott looked at her. James Whitmore came to the hospital, Claire said. He heard his car had been destroyed on Christmas morning, and he came to make sure the person who destroyed it was alive. I did not contact him. He contacted me. I want the record to be accurate on that point, Scott nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Cole. No further questions. She stepped down from the stand. She walked back to the prosecution table. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. She did not look at Nathan. She looked at the jury. 12 people, 12 different expressions, some neutral, some moved. One woman, in the second row, was looking at her hands with an expression that Claire recognized. The expression of a woman who is thinking about something from her own life. Claire hoped she was wrong. She hoped that woman had never felt this particular thing. She suspected she was not wrong. She suspected that in any group of 12 American women, drawn at random, the odds were not good that none of them knew this particular shape of fear. That was the thing nobody wanted to say, that this was not exceptional, that this was common enough to be statistical. Rachel appeared at her elbow during the recess. You were, Rachel said, and then stopped. What? Claire said. I don't have the word, Rachel said. And I'm a person with a lot of words. Claire looked at her. You were true, Rachel said finally. That's it. That's the word. You were just completely true up there. Claire nodded. James caught her eye from across the corridor during the recess. He nodded once. That was all. She nodded back. Closing arguments began the following morning. Catherine Walsh laid out the case with the steady efficiency of someone assembling something that could not be disassembled once built. Then Bradley Fitch, still pleasant, still smooth, making his final argument for reasonable doubt. The jury retired to deliberate on a Friday afternoon. Claire went home to the guest house. Hope was with Rachel for the weekend. The house was quiet. She sat in the nursery in the rocking chair and looked at the crib where Hope slept every night with her particular determined energy, taking up every inch of her 4 pounds 9 ounces. "Whatever comes next," Claire said to the empty room. She had said that a lot in the last 4 months. Whatever comes next. It was not resignation. It was the specific kind of peace that comes from having done everything you could do, from having told the truth as completely and clearly as you were capable of. Whatever came next was out of her hands. She had done her part. She rocked in the chair and waited. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Day 1. Claire worked from home because she had started working again in March, a marketing director position at a mid-size firm in Manhattan, a job she had interviewed for and gotten on her own merits. And she was good at it, in the way she had always been good at it. Before Nathan systematically removed every version of her professional confidence. Day 2, Rachel came over. They watched 3 episodes of a 90s romantic comedy that Rachel had strong opinions about and ordered delivery from 4 different places because they could not agree. Day 3, James sent a text that said, "Still here." Claire stared at it for a long time. Then she texted back, "I know. Thank you." His reply, "Don't thank me. Get some sleep." She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about the jury, 12 people in a room together, trying to agree on what was true. She thought about what it meant to be believed. She had been believed by Detective Foster the day she woke up in the hospital. She had been believed by Dr. Reynolds, who had stayed in her room while she gave her statement. She had been believed by Rachel, who had known for 2 years before Claire was ready to say it clearly. She had been believed by James, without question, without hesitation, in a way that still made her chest feel strange when she thought about it too directly. She hoped 12 strangers would believe her too. She thought, "I have done what I can do." She thought, that has to be enough. Day 4, 10 in the morning. Scott called. "Note from the jury," he said. "They've reached a verdict." Claire's heart did something complex. 1 hour, she said. 1 hour, Scott said. She called Rachel first. Rachel said, "On my way." She called James second. He said, "I'll drive." She got dressed in the same clothes she had worn on the first day of testimony, because she was superstitious about this in a way she would not have admitted to Scott. They drove to the courthouse. James parked. They walked in. The gallery was already full. People who had followed the case online and wanted to be there for the moment. The specific theater of accountability. Nathan was already at the defense table when Claire took her seat. He looked worse than he had at the start of the trial. Thinner, grayer, the particular aging that happened to people when the performance finally cost too much to maintain. He looked at her. She looked back. She did not look away first. The jury filed in. 12 people, 4 days of deliberation, finding their seats with the careful movement of people who understood the weight of what they were carrying. The judge asked the forewoman to stand. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, how do you find?" The forewoman looked at the paper in her hands. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom exhaled. Not silence. The opposite. The release of held breath. Collective, physiological. Claire sat very still. "On the charge of assault, in the first degree, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of insurance fraud, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of financial fraud, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of conspiracy, how do you find?" "Guilty." Each word a separate sentence. Each word a separate stone being placed. Margaret screamed from the gallery. Security moved immediately. She was still screaming when they escorted her out, her voice rising and then fading, Nathan's name and injustice and they're lying. And then the courtroom doors closed and she was gone. Nathan did not scream. Nathan sat with his face white as paper while his lawyers put their hands on his arm and spoke to him in low voices, and he stared at the middle distance with the expression of a man who had genuinely believed, right up until this moment, that he was going to win. The judge thanked the jury, set sentencing for 2 weeks, remanded Nathan to custody. As the officers came to escort Nathan out, he turned and found Claire's face in the crowd. He mouthed something. She watched his lips. Could have been anything. She did not let herself interpret it. She turned away. Outside the courthouse, reporters, questions, cameras, microphones angled toward Claire's face. Scott handled them. Claire stood next to Scott and said nothing, which was the instruction, and watched the cameras and thought about 4 years and a balcony and a baby asleep in a car seat 3 blocks away with Rachel and a golden retriever named Bailiff. A reporter pushed a microphone toward Rachel, who was standing to Claire's left. "How does your client feel?" the reporter asked. Rachel looked at the microphone. She looked at the camera. "She feels," Rachel said, "like a woman who survived Christmas morning and a 5-story fall and an attempted murder and a 4-day jury deliberation in the same 12 months. She feels like someone who got up every single day and kept going when stopping would have been so much easier. She feels like the most impractical miracle I have ever personally witnessed." The reporter blinked. "She feels like a mother who made sure her daughter was born into a safe world," Rachel said. "Any other questions?" There were other questions. Rachel answered none of them. She found Claire's arm with her hand and said, very quietly, "Let's go home." They went home. Sentencing was 2 weeks later. 28 years, with the possibility of parole in 22. Nathan Cole would be 61 years old when he was first eligible for the conversation about what freedom might mean. Hope would be 22. Claire sat in her own apartment, watching the sentencing coverage on her laptop, with Rachel beside her on the couch and Bailiff across both their feet. 28 years, Rachel said. "I know," Claire said. "How does it feel?" Claire thought about it honestly. "Like a number," she said. "Like something accurate. Like it's never quite going to feel the right size, no matter what it was. But like it's real. Like it happened." She paused. "Like it's over," she said. Rachel reached over and put her hand over Claire's. "Like it's over," Rachel agreed. Bailiff, who was a large golden retriever and had very definite opinions about emotional moments requiring physical weight, shifted himself further across both of them. Claire looked at her apartment, her name on the lease, her deposit, her choice of furniture, which was secondhand and mismatched and perfect. A crib in the corner of the bedroom, a baby monitor on the coffee table, a window with good light, a life. 8 months after the verdict, on a New Year's Eve that was cold and clear and smelling like wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace, Claire stood in front of her bathroom mirror and looked at herself. 33 years old, scarred in the places you could not see, healing in the places you could. A woman who could not entirely stop checking the locks at night, who still sometimes woke with her heart pounding from a dream she could not remember, who had learned that surviving and thriving were not the same thing, but that one could become the other with enough time and a very good therapist. Hope sat in her bouncer on the bathroom floor, working with intense concentration on the project of getting her own foot into her mouth, which she had been pursuing for 3 days with the determination of someone who believed in ambitious goals. "You're going to get it," Claire told her. Hope ignored this and focused. Claire looked in the mirror. "Hello," she said to the woman looking back. The woman looked okay. Actually okay. Not performed okay. Not managed okay. Actually, that was something. Bailiff appeared in the doorway. looking at them with the patient expression of a dog who had been informed that they were going to a party and was prepared to be supportive about it. New Year's Eve. James's penthouse. Small gathering, Rachel, Scott, a few people from Claire's office, a few people from James's world, the low-key version of the life James lived, the version he preferred, which she had learned over the course of a year of careful, honest, unpressured friendship. She had learned a lot over the course of a year. She had learned that she was good at her job, which she had always known but had needed to reprove to herself. She had learned that hope had her laugh, which Rachel identified immediately and with great satisfaction. She had learned that golden retrievers were incompatible with having intact throw pillows, but compatible with everything else. She had learned that she could trust again, slowly, selectively, starting small, as James had suggested, and expanding carefully. She had learned the difference between a man who loved her and a man who owned her. They drove to the penthouse. James answered the door himself because James was not a person who stood on ceremony in his own home. He looked at Hope first, in the carrier on Claire's chest, and Hope looked back at him with the absolute directness of 8-month-olds who had not yet learned social filtering. "Hi, Evie," James said. It was the name he had started using, a shortening of a nickname Rachel had invented, which Hope responded to with the same enthusiasm she applied to most things. Hope grabbed his finger. He looked up at Claire. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. This was how it had been for months. Easy and honest and without the quality of performance that Claire now recognized as one of the signs she should have read years ago. Everything with Nathan had been performance. Everything with James was just what it was. The party was small and warm and full of the kind of conversation that came from people who liked each other. Rachel arrived in a dress she described as festive but threatening and spent the first hour in detailed strategic debate with Scott about something related to an unrelated legal matter that escalated into a genuine argument and then into something that looked by 11 o'clock like the beginning of a friendship. Scott, Claire observed to James, has never met anyone who argues with him on equal terms. James, watching them, he seems to find it stimulating. Rachel seems to find it stimulating too, Claire said. James looked at her. Should we be concerned? Probably not, Claire said. Rachel has excellent judgment about people. Eventually. At 11:50, the group gathered by the windows. The city below was already beginning its celebrations, pockets of light and noise rising up through the cold air. The countdown was 10 minutes away. James found his way to her. This was not by chance. He found his way to her with the same quiet intention that characterized everything he did. "I want to tell you something," he said. Claire looked at him. She was not afraid of what he was about to say. That was new. That was actually new. "Okay," she said. "I'm not going to tell you I love you," James said, "because that's too much pressure for a New Year's Eve, and I don't want to make this a moment you have to respond to." Claire raised an eyebrow. "I'm going to tell you," he said, "that the year I've spent being your friend has been one of the best years of my life, and that I don't need it to be more than that, and that if it becomes more than that, I would like it to be because you decided it, not because I applied pressure on a holiday." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "That's," she said, "genuinely the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me on New Year's Eve." "I'm aware," James said. "It's also," she said, "exactly what I needed to hear." He looked at her. "I'm getting there," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there. Take all the time you need," James said. "You keep saying that. I keep meaning it." The countdown started. 10, 9, 8. The room gathered around the windows, counting together with the kind of collective goodwill that New Year's reliably produced, people who wanted to believe that the turning of a number meant something. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year. Cheers. The city outside exploded with light. Claire stood at the window with James's shoulder warm against hers, not touching beyond that, just the simple fact of proximity, and watched the fireworks rise and bloom and fade over the skyline. Hope was with Rachel's mother tonight, sleeping through the beginning of a new year in the absolute confidence of a person who did not yet know that years had endings. She would know someday. Hope would learn, eventually, that things ended, that people failed you, that the world was unreliable in specific and personal ways. She would learn this because everyone learned this, because there was no immunization against it. But she would also learn because Claire would show her, by example, what it looked like to survive that, what it looked like to tell the truth when lying was easier, what it looked like to start over when starting over seemed impossible, what it looked like to choose every day the harder version of your own life, because the harder version was the real one. Claire had things she needed to say. Not to James, not tonight. Tonight was not the night for those things, and she had learned, finally, to honor her own timing, but to herself, to the woman in the bathroom mirror, to the version of herself she was becoming. She had spent 4 years making herself smaller. She had spent a year growing back into her actual size. She was not finished. She would not be finished for a long time. Healing was not a destination, Dr. Coleman said, every Tuesday. It was a practice, but she was here, standing at a window in a penthouse, alive and employed and raising a daughter who grabbed life with both hands and did not let go. She was here, and she was choosing, actively and deliberately, to be here. That was the thing nobody talked about on the other side of survival, that it required an ongoing choice, that getting out was not the end of the story, that the story continued, ordinary and complicated, and sometimes very good, and that you had to keep choosing it. She chose it. She would keep choosing it. Outside, the fireworks continued their patient argument that the future was worth celebrating. The city below, millions of people, and all their millions of small, impossible lives, moved into another year. Claire pressed her forehead briefly to the glass, feeling the cold of it. "Hello," she said. To the year, to herself. "Welcome back." She turned from the window. James was beside her, looking at hers with the expression she had stopped being afraid of, the one that meant he saw her clearly and without the need to edit what he saw. She took his hand. Not more than that, just his hand. Just this. Just the ordinary miracle of standing next to someone who made you feel like yourself. That was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough. In the morning, she would go home to her apartment and her daughter and her dog and her actual imperfect life. She would check the locks twice. She would go to therapy on Tuesday. She would answer her emails and do her job and take Hope to the park and call Rachel and all the 100 small, ordinary things that added up to a life. She would also, at some point, tell James that she loved him. Not tonight, but someday soon, when the words were ready and not before. She had learned to trust her own timing. For now, she stood at the window with his hand in hers, watching the city celebrate another beginning, and she let herself feel it. The thing that had taken a 5-story fall and a year of fighting and a daughter named Hope to teach her that she deserved this, the ordinary warmth of it, the simple continuity of a life that was hers, that she had always deserved it. She had just forgotten for a while. She remembered now. Closing editorial disclaimer. The story you just heard was researched, constructed, and carefully edited by hand, by real people who believe that narrative has the power to heal, to teach, and to remind us that we are never as alone as we feel in our darkest moments. Every dramatic element, every emotional arc, every moment of this story was built with intention, not for shock, but for meaning. We do not produce content to exploit pain. We produce content to honor the truth that lives inside it. Thank you for trusting us with your time. We do not take that lightly.